Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast, the show where I explore human decision-making as a risk and what we can do about it. This episode is all about magic, money and the mind. Three things you might not immediately think of as having much in common, but they do. The first thing they have in common is that they're all things my guest on this episode, Paul Craven, knows all about. Paul has had a highly successful career in financial services, during which he developed an interest in behavioural science as he saw how it could help him in his work. He's also a magician who uses behavioural science to inform his stagecraft. In this episode, Paul explains how the ways in which our brains work can, if left unchecked, be drivers of bad decision-making, and if we learn how to master them, drivers of good decision-making. They're also what allows magic to happen. By playing with how we perceive the world, magicians can make magic. In our discussion, we also explore how Paul came to be interested in the mind and how he applied it in his work in financial services. The lessons he shares are relevant whichever industry you're in. Paul is an accomplished speaker, and given he's also a magician, he's great at engaging an audience. His performance on this podcast is no exception, not least because he also shows that it's possible to do a magic trick on a podcast. You'll need to be stationary for that to work, so if you're planning on listening to this while driving or getting exercise, you might want to factor in a brief pause around the 5-minute mark so you can join in. I've put in a 1-minute warning so you'll know when it's coming. What you're about to hear is an extremely engaging, highly insightful guest sharing some fascinating stories. So please enjoy my conversation with Paul Craven on magic, money, and the mind. Paul, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. Look, I know you and what you're all about, but my listeners might not. So can you give us a little bit of a pen portrait as to who you are and what you're interested in?
Gosh, Paul Craven, 56 years old. I was lucky enough to enjoy almost 30 years in the City of London. I worked for three firms, Schroders, PIMCO and Goldman Sachs. But in the last few years, I left the city in about 2014 to set up something I was passionately interested in, which was the idea of behavioural science. How could I use behavioural science? I've learned about it in the previous decade working for those firms. What could I do with it? How could I make a difference? And I started off by thinking, well, maybe I can, help a few people here and there. And I hadn't realised how quickly Paul Craven Partners would take off. And I ended up doing about 40 or 50 talks a year and consultancy, I should say, working with both asset managers and actually lawyers, doctors, and various other professions as well. Explain them sort of wondrous benefits of using behavioural science.
Fantastic stuff. And you also have an interest in magic. And I can't let you get on the show without talking a little bit around that. So I wondered if we could maybe start with that and just talk a little bit around your interest and passion for that as well.
Well, I think actually, it comes down to a general interest in psychology, and which is where the behavioural science comes in. And to be honest with you, I sometimes when I'm doing magic or practicing magic or learning about magic or reading about magic or performing magic, I don't quite know where behavioural science stops and magic starts. I think they join around the back of the circle. And what I think interests me most of all about magic, and I think it was Teller who said, the core of every trick is a cold cognitive experiment in perception. Now, if that isn't a definition in a different way of behavioural science, tell me what is. Which perception is reality. And I think I love magic because I love being surprised. I love the idea of how can create a sense of wonder. There is nothing, Christian, more joyous than watching an adult open-mouthed like a child, that sort of sense of wonder. And I often become that adult like a child as well, watching a good magician. But I love performing it. I love doing it. And I think actually it does genuinely, in all seriousness, it helps you, gives me a lot of clues as to how the human mind does work and indeed doesn't always work very well. If you want, it's quite hard to do magic in a podcast, clearly, because no one can see me. But
Hi, Christian here. Just interrupting Paul to give you that 1 minute warning I promised that he's going to do his piece of audio magic. Do try to make sure you're sitting down and able to move freely. This isn't something you're going to want to do whilst driving a vehicle. With that said, back to Paul.
I'll give it a go. I'll try something. If anybody listening to this wants to give it a go, let's try and do something a bit magical. I want everyone who's listening to just raise their right index finger in the air. So their index finger is pointing up towards the ceiling. And I want to do a big number 6 from the top, doing a big number 6 with your right index finger. That's perfect. I'm sure you're all doing that now. Now, forget about your right finger for a second. Just think about your right foot, just your right foot. And just with your right foot, forget your finger, just do a clockwise circle with your right foot. It could be just around the ankle, a small. Okay, now everyone's hopefully doing their clockwise circle with their right foot. Now, in a second, I'm going to ask you to do number 6 with your right index finger again as your foot is going round. And what will happen is it will turn your foot round from going clockwise to going anti-clockwise. Try it now.
Whoa! That just happened. Wow.
Yeah, I do that. I do a lot of, as I say, a lot of public speaking, a lot of talks, and I've done that to tens of thousands of people in the audience over the years. And I've only ever found 2 people that can do it, can genuinely have their finger and foot going in opposite directions. And one was a ballet dancer and one was a drummer, but no one else like I've ever found. Anyway, it's a bit of fun. I say it's magic. It shows you the mind works in strange ways sometimes.
And it's fascinating because, as you say, it's a behavioral science piece. It's sort of saying, okay, we have a perception of reality, we interpret what's going on, and then we sort of, and in that case, we channel the way our body works physically, because we can control it. But in other cases, it's the thoughts that we have and the decisions of what's going on inside our brain that's triggered it. And I'm fascinated by this linkage between the two things, because I think what you've beautifully highlighted there is that we don't necessarily think logically. The reason you can get away with optical illusions is because actually it's not really seeing everything that's there. So trade secret here, I'm guessing, magicians don't cut people in half. That's not generally what's going on. We're fooled into thinking that is what's happening. So we're playing with people's perceptions of the world. And I think that's a really fascinating thing that, you're highlighting the fact that much of what we do and interpret is based on a perception.
Yeah, I mean, perception is everything. And the interesting thought on it, the brain is hardwired, or certainly pre-wired, to make lots of mental shortcuts. We know that, heuristics, biases, etc. And I think what the magic lover in me likes is that actually when you're trying to fool someone, what you're essentially doing is to give them some fake shortcuts. So I won't reveal anything, obviously, but yes, you're right that nobody really gets cut in half in real life. But how is it can look so damn convincingly, so brilliantly done and fool everybody? I mean, it's interesting because there was a famous magician called Fred Capps, and I've heard this quote years and years ago, and I thought about it, and I actually think he's right based on my experience of doing a lot of magic. Capps said, intelligent people are the easiest to fool. They're always looking for a complicated solution. And that's brilliant though, isn't it? And it's funny because when I do stuff when I'm performing, and obviously I do a little bit of magic when I'm doing these talks on behavioural science because I want to illustrate the way the mind does and doesn't work. It is interesting to see actually how some people just almost want to sit back and enjoy it and just relax and think, I'll let my mind go and there are others that are really trying to sort of analyse and of course it's very rare that someone will work out how something's done because they can't rewind the camera backwards in their head. But I do think it does reveal some very interesting stuff and the true mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible, as Mr. Wilde once said. And I think magic just really does emphasise that you're actually seeing stuff that really shouldn't be happening. And I love it.
And how does that make you look at the world? Because it's, there's an obvious thing if you talk to someone like Daniel Kahneman around the cognitive biases, for example, he will say, it doesn't matter how often I still fall prey to these things because that's how we're programmed. So you can't kind of you switch them all off, but obviously a little bit more. I'm intrigued to know whether does magic change your perspective on, obviously you'll know your own tricks, but are you looking at the world differently? Do you look at the world through a magician's eyes and think about things slightly differently, therefore spot things maybe the rest of us don't?
I'd like to think so, but I'd be the first to admit, in all humility, that I have biases. I make mistakes based on emotions, and that old adage. In fact, one of the first adages I remember was this idea of the Jonathan Haidt, the emotional tail wags the rational dog. And however rational you and I think we're doing or being in our jobs, in our lives, whatever it may be to be doing, we do often let ourselves fall prey to our emotions. The emotional tail does wag the rational dog, and it's very hard to shake off. I think I would say that the first lesson of behavioural science is just being aware that you have biases makes them slightly less dangerous. That would be my first sort of overall instinct. Just being aware that I may have confirmation bias or want to join the bandwagon, or I may want to conform because of the conformity bias and so on and so forth. Just being aware of that helps me to just maybe step back a bit and try and analyse it in a slightly different way. That's really sort of the first lesson. I think the second thing is that behavioural science, and indeed I'll throw in magic as well, I think it helps you to get a different perspective. And, a change in perspective is worth 80 IQ points, according to Alan Kay. And I've never, if you can just look at it. So take it from, take anything take social media, everybody fighting each other about politics or Brexit or Trump or whatever it may be. It doesn't matter what the issue is. It's very hard for most people to say, let me consider my opposition's argument. Let me think about where they might be right. It's so hard to do as a human being. Or let's take it back to investment, my industry of almost 3 decades. If I like a stock that I've analysed and done all this work on, and I've really come to the conclusion this is worth buying, and I've recommended to all my team this is worth buying this stock, the question I must always ask myself before I tell them, but even after I've told them, is where could I be wrong? And, confirmation bias is probably the most pernicious bias in many ways, because we just do it. We think we've got a smart, clever idea. It may well be a smart, clever idea, but we end up just trying to gather information that makes it seem even smarter and cleverer. And we might just filter out or disregard stuff that doesn't quite conform to our view of the stock or the world or politics, whatever it may be. And so I think that's that I think is very interesting, is behavioural science has helped me, I hope, and certainly the people I work with, just don't think there may be other perspectives when we look at. Our minds do play tricks. Our minds do make shortcuts. And I kind of got into this whole thing, though, Christian. It's quite interesting how it all started, because there were a bunch of economists who were sort of getting quite irate that Kahneman had been given the Nobel Prize for Economics. And I didn't know much about, in those days, about behavioural science. I'm not sure people were using the phrase behavioural science back in the early 2000s, or certainly not much before that. And here I was, and I said, well, what's the problem with him winning the Nobel Prize for Economics? And they were saying, he's a psychologist. And I remember thinking, that sounds interesting. Why don't I go away and have a look and read some of the stuff he's done? And I became just hooked on the whole thing. And the fact this psychologist was telling me about things like investment markets, the stuff that I thought I had been trained in and knew a little bit about. And it kind of, again, a completely new perspective. And that is where I think that my first interest in it sort of started to grow in the early 2000s. And then I became passionate about the whole thing. And I know passionate's a bit of a corny word. It's used too much these days, but I really was passionate about it, about how to use it in 2 different ways. If you accept my definition of behavioural science as being how real people make real decisions in the real world, as opposed to how they're supposed to make decisions according to efficient market theorists and economists and things, but how real people make real decisions in the real world. There are only two ways that I've tried to use it in my life, and one is to become a better investor, or to help people become a better investor. It's identifying their biases and then trying to remove those biases and trying to help them understand it. And that's a kind of investment thing. But then there's something also more general than that, which is, can you use this stuff to be more persuasive, more influential in your life with your colleagues, your friends, your family, etc. Because I think one of the joys about this idea of gaining extra perspectives on how people make decisions is that it can help you in communication. And if you can communicate better using behavioral science techniques and little tricks, little psychological tricks, I'll call them that, then why not use them? And so one of the things that I was lucky enough to get involved with, I was a portfolio manager for the first half of my career. And the second half of my career, I was involved with selling and distribution of good products. And if you have a product or a solution for a client that you think is a good thing to sell, and I emphasize that this does require ethics, then why not present it in a way that makes it most likely to be accepted? Why not improve your chances of selling it? And I think, again, behavioral science, I think, has just given me so many little ways of doing things, often reframing something, talking more about the client, benefits to the client, and that have actually been incredibly helpful. So I was very lucky because I was using this stuff throughout the second half of my career, and from both an investment point of view and a communication point of view.
And I'm fascinated by that point around selling something. And then you just very quickly said, and of course that requires an ethical start point or words to that effect. And I think that's really interesting because people often look at it and go, oh, well, this behavioral science stuff is all about manipulation. There's almost the logic that you look at with the magic trick, they're up to something. And in the case of magic, that's a good thing because it's here to entertain and engage. But imagine you use those things for to sell me stuff I don't need. And of course, we know about financial services and mis-selling.
Yep.
And so there is this idea that the vehicle, the ability to persuade people, that's the bad things, the evil. And I look at it a little bit like saying, well, you can use a car to run someone over, to get away from a bank robbery. There's a whole load of things but you can also use a car to take someone to hospital, to deliver food to people for good things. And I see it very much as a vehicle. And I'm fascinated by that ethical piece there, because I think you're spot on, which is sort of, it's phrased as manipulation, but actually there's a positive spin on it. And it's whatever you put through those funnels, you can use it for bad, but you can also use it for tremendous good. And we tend to, I think people, spin doctoring would be a good example of a very negative slant on this skill set, when actually it has a very positive aspect as well.
Yeah, that's spot on. And it's not about mind control or some sort of hypnotic, how do I convince the audience that I'm, the stories. This is genuinely about how to present something in a better way. And I tend to, go back to this idea of if you can give the audience a different perspective on it, then you become more persuasive. I mean, this stuff isn't new though, Christian. I mean, the point is that, Aristotle thousands of years ago was talking about logos, three ways of persuading someone in your rhetorical speeches. He was saying logos, which is logic, and that's kind of consistent with what we do now. We try and present data and say we have a logical idea. He talked about ethos, which is about the credibility of the presenter or the seller or the credibility of the firm you work for. But what we, I think, have often lacked, certainly in my industry, in the financial industry, I wouldn't say this applies as much to advertising in the more consumer areas, but what we've lacked is the third leg of Aristotle's advice on rhetoric is pathos. So here's his logos, ethos, pathos. And pathos is essentially trying to be a little bit more playing towards the more emotional side of a human being. Why should we just go for what we think is a logical argument? I mean, again, how real people make real decisions in the real world. Now, if we all did it absolutely logically, we'd all be like Spock. That's not how we do it. We're not like Spock. We're more like Kirk in Starship Enterprise. And so you've got to use this thing called pathos. And again, so let's give some little examples. Presentations. Now, the city presentations are notorious about, you'll start off with lots of information about your firm that you work for. You'll probably have a map of the world with your offices all over the place, and you'll try and boast about how big and wonderful you are. And by the way, this is presentations for 30 years have looked like this, in most of them. And that's maybe a logical thing to do. And it's certainly trying to establish your ethos as who you are. That's fine. I'm not saying these things are bad at all. But what it immediately lacks is pathos, because we haven't mentioned the client at all. We haven't talked about the client's problem. We haven't talked about what the client's challenged wants solving. And so just by, again, reframing some of the presentation material can make it more about the client, makes it much more powerful, because people like to talk about themselves. and not want to hear about how many officers I've got around the world necessarily. So I'm not dissing the logos and the ethos side. I'm just saying don't forget the pathos side and remember who the client is and why you're there. And so once you start to think about that, and you start to think about, rather than how good I am, what are the benefits to the client of this product, this solution? First of all, then this gets over the ethics thing. It's got to be a good thing to sell. It's got to be good for the client. And the client's got to recognize the fact there are benefits to him or her. But sometimes you have to tell that. You have to tell the client that rather than expect them to work it out. And I think too many presentations are just data-driven. They're very, very fact-driven. And this is good stuff, but it's not enough. And so one of the things that I enjoyed doing was trying to recreate presentations. And I do workshops on this now, how to make better presentations. Go through every page. What's the message of that page? What's the so what, as we used to call it? What's the benefit of the client of this page? Not what's the benefit to you as the presenter. And once you start to create this different perspective, they become much more readable for a start, because you start to cut out lots of jargon, but they become much more empathetic towards what the client is. And I can't help but think, and it's the problem with, say, the city over perhaps many years, it's got a sort of bad image in some ways, in some quarters. It's not helped by sort of when the media do a picture of the city, they'll show a trading room with people screaming down phones and things. But the trouble with that is it makes the city seem very transactional. What's your price, Gov? It's this. I'll have 100. Thanks. But actually, a lot of the long-term business in the city is not transactional. It's relationship-driven. It's about, for example, I was involved with long-term pensions. I was involved with trying to secure good portfolio returns for long-term institutional pension fund clients. And the last thing you want is to have a transactional relationship that one side might feel they've had a bad deal on. But if you can build a relationship that lasts 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years in the case of a pension fund, everybody benefits because there's a lot of trust involved. And so, people like you, they'll talk to you. If people trust you, they'll entrust you with their money. And if you do a good job, they'll let you keep the money for a long time, as long as you keep doing a good job. And that's the basis of a relationship. So I've always felt that relationships are much more important than transactions. However, it's the transactions that make the news when something goes wrong, and the media, not unfairly, blow it up because it's a big thing.
So much I want to unpick there. But I mean, that latter point you made around short-term versus long-term in relationships is really interesting, because actually you're right. If you look at all of the things that sort of have gone wrong and will continue, I suspect, to go wrong in financial services, it is around these sort of short-term thinking. So people do things to drive their bonuses in the short term. You've got mis-selling, where there's an information asymmetry between the person selling the product and the person buying it. And actually you won't see, insurance is a great example. I always think you don't know whether you've got a good insurance policy until you come to claim. And that might be well down the line. So with the blather that you hear, if you hear sort of slick salespeople selling you stuff, it's sort of irrelevant. You need to be speaking to someone that's tried to claim on the policy, and then you'll have a clue as to whether this thing is actually any good or not. And so this long-term versus short-term thing, I think, is fascinating, because it plays into classic piece of behavioral science, which is, generally speaking, we react to short-term things. And we know that the further out it is, the less capable in many respects we are as a human being of thinking about it. So I'm really intrigued by this idea. And I agree with you fundamentally around the relationship nature of financial services. That's not what hits the headlines, but there's a lot of stuff that does go into those longer term relationships. And sort of traditionally, banking relationships were longer term. But there is this tension where, as you say, it's the short term stuff that's the sort of letting the industry down in many respects. And that's a cognitive weakness that we all have.
Yeah, definitely. And in fact, we are all, and I was about to say we're all human. We are drawn in by the short-term temptations. And, this would apply to anything, not just, dieting. It's very easy to think, I'll have one donut today. It won't do any harm. But a donut every day, it's the sort of compounding effect. In 10 or 15 years' time, that extra few hundred calories compounds up. But it's so easy to be seduced by the short-term transactional nature of, particularly there's sort of, should we say, dopamine involved, and the pleasure of profit or the pleasure of a donut or whatever. I'm reminded of a story allegedly about Mark Twain, and it kind of makes the point about relationships versus transactions. Mark Twain was traveling in, I think, the 19th century America. He was going to one of the towns, and on the edge of a town, he saw a gang of boys, teenage boys, and they were sort of looked like they were being nasty to a younger child. And he went over and said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Look, mister, this little kid here is really stupid." And Mark Twain said, "Well, why? Tell me what's going on." And the kid said, the elder kid of the bullies said, "Watch this." And they gave this young kid 2 coins, a 5 cents, a nickel, and a 10 cents, a dime. And for those of you that they know this, the 5 cents is a bigger coin. The dime is a small coin. The 10 cents, the more valuable one, is a smaller coin. The 5 cents is a bigger coin. And they said, "Mister, watch this." So they said, "Okay," whatever his name was, "you can keep whichever one you want." And the kid looks at them and weighs them up and looks and says, "Can I have the big one?" In other words, could I have the nickel? And the kids and the bullies say, "They are, mister, told you he was stupid." They take their dime back and they leave the kid with the 5 cents. And the gang goes off. And Twain's left there with the little boy who's holding his 5 cents. And he said, "Are you okay?" And the kid said, "Yeah, I'm okay, I'm fine." And kind of wiped away what appeared to be crocodile tears. And Twain said, "You do realize they said you were stupid? You were a bit stupid because you were offered a 5 cents and a 10 cents. And you took the 5 cents. The kid said, "I know," he said. "I know that," he said. "But if I didn't take the 5 cents, they wouldn't play this game with me every day."
Love it.
So relationships matter more than transactions. Anyway, that's a slightly unethical tale, but it's a lovely story. But it does remind me, you want to be in the game for tomorrow. Whatever it is you do, you want to be playing the game. Not just today, not tomorrow, but hopefully next week, next month, next year, and next decade. And this takes me on to one of the great lessons of the whole behavioural science when it comes to investment is, how do you do well? How do you maximise your chances of doing well over the longer term? And one of the great beliefs I've had in my life is a funny thing. I was about probably a few days into my career, and a gentleman called Keith Niven dropped I think it was about a 6 pages photostat in those days of a paper called "Winning the Loser's Game" by Charles Ellis, and it had originally been published in 1975. I read it for the first time in 1986, and about 6 pages long, and it was an article that Charles Ellis had written in which he talked about investment, and he talked about how to survive, basically. And his big theme was too many people try and win quickly at investment. They kind of try and to use in baseball, they want to knock the ball out of the park, or in tennis, they want to serve an ace or smash it or whatever. And Ellis had looked at lots of unit trust data, or mutual funds, as they called it in those days, obviously in America, and determined that the mutual funds that did well weren't often the best performing ones in any short period of time. There were much more interesting, aggressive, whiz kid type funds that were doing well. But the ones that did well over the long term survived. In other words, some of the better performing short term funds did really well 1 quarter or 1 year, and then did really badly the following year, and then probably did really badly the following year. And essentially, or they gained too many assets in the short term because they were too successful. They got top heavy and they couldn't keep their philosophy up, whatever. But the ones that just kept going, in tennis terms, he'd love to use these tennis metaphors, and it's brilliant. Just get the ball back, and hence winning the loser's game. So tennis, for example, is how many people actually win points in amateur tennis by serving an ace or doing a shot that's not hit? How many people win points by their opponent hitting it into the net or off the end of the court? And the answer is, by a huge factor in amateur tennis, you win a point because your opponent loses the point. He or she hits in the net or off the end of the court. And it does work not quite as well, but pretty well in professional tennis as well. But certainly amateur tennis, it's perfect. And Ellis wrote this paper, Winning the Loser's Game, where he said investment should be like tennis. Get the ball back. Don't try and smash it really hard. Don't try and play an extraordinary shot that it might work, but it might not. Get the ball back. And the principle is if you keep doing that as an investor, your opponents drop away because they're going to try and smash the ball out. And, of course, if you keep playing the game, you have the power of compounding. We know about the effects of compounding long. You stay in the game. and the money you're making gets reinvested and you're staying in the game again. So even though you might have, say, third or even third quartile performance in the first year or two, just by doing that and surviving, you'll move up second quartile, first quartile longer term as a survivor. And listen, I'm not trying to tell anybody how to invest money. I'm just saying as a principle, not losing is a pretty good place to start. And not losing it quickly. There's an old flying out. A friend of mine is a pilot, and he said you hear this about 4,000 times before you ever get your license. An old flying adage. There were old pilots and there were bold pilots, but there were no old, bold pilots. Now, I heard that. I thought to myself, I've heard that before. Oh, no, I hadn't heard it before, but I'll tell you what, this works. There were old investors and there were bold investors, but there aren't many old, bold investors, i.e. people that want to smash the ball back in tennis terms. And so, again, this idea of trying to just realize that if it's about the long term, that was the key for this thread of the conversation. If it's about relationships, because relationships are about trust, then we recognize those two things. We then, by definition, can be better at our jobs. We're better investors and better with our clients, and our clients better with us. The problem with a lot of it is that we've been seen as being too short term, and indeed sometimes elements of the city have been too short term. So it's nice to try and get some of these messages out. And I think when you tell people this, they get it. They really do get it. However, the tyranny of the spreadsheet, where people are demanding higher and higher short-term profits to satisfy shareholders or analysts, is always there. But I think the long term, I think clients appreciate it, and that's frankly what should matter most.
And I was struck sort of threading two things together. You said, I mean, you talked about you just talked about tyranny of spreadsheets, but there's also tyranny of PowerPoint. And as you were talking about those standardized presentations, and I was giggling to myself because in a previous life, I used to put those things together. And you know, and all the things so you'd have to put a league table in there somewhere, and it was a requirement of you wouldn't put a league table in unless you were demonstrating that you were high up in that table. So you would cut the data to be allowed to demonstrate that you were, I don't know, number one at doing IPOs on a Tuesday. I mean, utterly irrelevant way of looking at the world, but if that got you there, that's what you did, and you produced this thing. And you're right, there were these standardized slides, and I think it's fascinating when you sort of look at the formatting that requires. Encourages that kind of standardized thing. So there's a lot of corporate, some of it's to do with branding, but some of it's to do with this is what we need to show because this is what we've always shown. And there are these patterns of behavior. And I think spreadsheets is a little bit the same thing, which is sort of we cleave to these structures, these models, that's the way we do things. And that's how we know we're doing it properly. And that in many respects, both PowerPoint and I'm sure I could throw some things that Word doesn't do well and all the other bits of software. But if you look at those, that's really constraining us. It's the reason I think some of these things really lead to bad outcomes is, in many respects, that's a bit inhumane, in that we're trying to sort of follow formulaic processes when the world, as we know, is complicated and grey and not always as predictable as we'd like.
Yeah. And actually, you've just jogged my memory. I'll go back. It must have been 20, 25 years ago. I was doing a pitch when I was at Schroders, and we were trying to win a large pension fund mandate, a large equity mandate for a big, well-known pension fund. And I went in as the salesperson, and my colleague, I think it was a guy called Chris Rogers, was the ex-brilliant portfolio manager. And we'd prepared, we'd done everything, we'd learned about the client, we knew the mandate, we'd done all the homework, taken nothing for granted. In fact, I don't think we could have done more in terms of preparing for this presentation. And we turned up, and there was a kind of horseshoe table, and we would sit. And so, kind of big, the investment committee and trustees were all around us. So we sat down, and there's the usual hello, welcome, and the chairman of trustees, as he was, said hello. Right, you've got 25 minutes for your pitch or whatever, and then we'll have Q&A, and then the standard things. And I go to get my briefcase to get out the 20 or so presentation documents that are in there. And as he's talking, and it was one of those old briefcases. Do you remember the ones where you had the sort of attaché case? You had to click the thing, and I clicked this thing, and one of the locks wouldn't open, and the books are stuck in there. and I'm beginning. I swear I'm trying to stay calm, but I must have showed it. And after about 20 seconds, and I can see people looking at me, burning me. And I looked up at the chair of trustees, and I said, "I'm terribly sorry." I said, "I think my briefcase is stuck." I can't get the documents out. And at this stage, he said, well, give it here. And so it's a bit like Cinderella's shoe being passed around the table. I mean, everyone is trying to open my bloody briefcase, and it doesn't open. And when it's got about 2/3 of the way around, and I didn't want everyone to try it because I think that would have been, I said, can we just forget that? We'll do it without books. We don't need the presentation books. And we won the business because we were so much more natural and normal and talking to them as opposed to using the book. Now, again, I'm not saying don't use books and don't pretend your briefcase is broken. My briefcase. Yeah.
Imagine that. Like that's somebody going, there we go. That's the formula.
My briefcase was genuinely broken, by the way. So we didn't. But sometimes we think, again, this is the pathos bit again, you see. We've done a logos. You're there because you've got ethos, because they know your firm, right? Logos, you're going to use that because that's how we get a lot of information across. We try and sound, intelligent. We try and make logical, rational, decent arguments. But it's the pathos that's often missing. Now, ironically, the briefcase incident was pure pathos because once I think maybe they felt a bit sorry for us initially and thought, well, this could be a real. But we're much more natural in some ways. And I think, again, when I'm doing my communication workshops, it's vital that people are natural. One of the years ago, and I've never done this myself, but I went to there's a gentleman called Bob Mobley in the US, who was one of my gurus many, many years ago, still going strong. And Bob got me in. I was doing a presentation skills thing with him, and I was pretty young in those days. And never forget this. He said, right, tomorrow morning, he said, he was an outside trainer. He came in to train us, and I'd met him the night before. And he said, right, for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I want you to knock on the door. I'll be in there. I'm going to be the client, right? As if you've never met me before. You are pitching this product, right? And you're going to do it with a book or however you would do it normally. No, I don't want any kind of informality, as if it was a proper presentation. So 9 o'clock the following morning, there I was, suited and booted, tie nicely tied, knocked on the door, come in. I said, good morning, Mr. Mobley. I'm here for the presentation. Please sit down. Thank you. And I start, well, I hand out the booklet out. So as you can see on page 1, and in those days, it probably was a sort of map of the world or how many offices we had or how much assets, whatever it was in those days. And he said, and I go through it fairly formal. I think I'm doing a good job. And after about 5 minutes, he says, okay, that's it, Paul, relaxed out. That's over. We'll come back to the thing. He said, before we get on to the work, tell me about your holiday. And I said, well, I just got back a few weeks ago. I had a wonderful holiday with the family in Mallorca or whatever it was we were doing. And he said, what was the best thing about it? And I said, the best thing was on the beach with the kids and the banana boat. We were messing around. And he asked me 3 or 4 questions about that. And I thought, when's he going to get back to the business? And he says, okay, so hang on a second. Let's just go back to page 4. Just take it up where you were on the presentation, where you left off, and do that again. And I go back and I say, well, as you can see, we have a philosophy here, the way we manage money, blah, 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 blah. Did that for a few minutes. He then said, oh, and by the way, back to the holiday. Tell me a bit more about what were you eating and drinking? And this went on for about 25 minutes in total. And he said, right, stop there, Paul. He said, have you worked out what's going on yet? I said, no. He said, watch this. And he pointed to the video camera that had been filming the whole time. He told me he was going to film me. I'd forgotten about it. And he played the film back. And there were 2 people there. There was Paul Craven presenting on behalf of the firm. Hello, it's welcome to be here. Happy to be here today. As you can see, we've got 57 offices around the world, blah, blah. And then there was Paul Craven. Oh, yeah, the holiday. That was great. We were banana boat with the kids. And on the video, you can see my posture change totally. I go from being sort of very upright and formal and stiff, and it's to being much more relaxed. And the more relaxed Paul Craven is a much more believable version, a much more credible person, because that's the real one, not the one who's in a suit. And as this film played on through the 25 minutes worth, because Bob was mixing me up between my presentation and the talking about the holiday stuff, they started to merge. So by the end, the last time that I was talking about the work stuff, it was just much more natural, much more authentic. It sounded like me. And he said, see the difference? I said, yeah. He said, be authentic, always be authentic. I know it's a cliche, but if you can do that, you come across as being more credible, I think, as opposed to, well, it's lovely to be here today on behalf of XYZ. Anyway, I've digressed, but we're talking about presentations and about trust. And I think it's an essential part of the whole thing, this idea that if you are looking to build a long-term relationship with a client, which I think should be most people's ambition with most products that I've seen in my life, then being yourself is a pretty good place to start.
I find that fascinating from a kind of human risk perspective. So what you've just looked at is sort of the business side of it, the kind of commercial end, if you like. Almost, sort of say we will sell things by building personal relationships with people, being ourselves. And I also look at it from the risk perspective. I got the same thing, which is if you come into an organization and they require you to behave in a manner that feels alien, not be yourself, not able to express any modicum of personality, then that's really hard work. And actually, it leads you to space that feels really inhuman. So I don't think it gets the most out of people, what I call human reward, getting the best out of your people. But I also think from a risk perspective, it's just a horrible environment to be in because nobody likes being, nobody likes being told to be someone different to who they are. That's why people who have yet to come out struggle with this issue because they're spending their whole lives having to pretend to be something that they're not. And I think that causes us huge amounts of stress. And I think it's a fascinating dynamic that many companies hire people. On the one hand, we're hiring the smartest bride, the brightest and the best and all that sort of stuff. And then what we do is we kind of try and control them a bit. And of course, you don't want somebody to be fully themselves at all times. There's stuff I can do at home. I always use walking around in my underwear as a good example that I probably shouldn't be doing in an office, right? That's not appropriate. And, so there's a limit to these things. But I think it's really interesting that actually, if you take human beings from the real world, and that's how you interview them, the interview discussions you'll be having is you as Paul Craven, not, that's what you're trying to suss out in the interview process. And then the organizations often take people and try and mold them in a way that isn't just a case of saying, let's fit in with the company culture. It's actually literally saying we expect you to behave very differently to your real self because that's what we do around here. I think is a real flaw. And I think one of the things that's interesting to start to see is companies that are going to be most successful, I think, is allowing people to do that. So far from it sort of feeling like a renegade act, that's what you want people. That's the best way you have diversity. Because otherwise, if you've just got people coming in, they're required to conform and be sterile, you're not getting the most of that thing. So I think you've really hit something on the head here, which is about this idea of if we want to get the most out, the best out of our human capital, we kind of need to allow that human capital to be itself to a certain extent.
Yeah, I know you had Rory Southern on recently, who's a good friend of mine, and Rory's one of his big points about hiring people is interesting. The trouble with hiring people in a sort of traditional way, and he's always said this, and I certainly when I look back on my experience, he's certainly right in my industry, is that typically you go and hire one person at a time. And, you'd have a set of candidates, you'd end up hiring the best person that you thought from a sort of set of 3 or 4. The trouble is if you do that to try and build a team over the course of a period of time, you'll end up employing all the same sorts of people. Now, if you were to hire the whole team at the same time, and again, there are sort of budgetary constraints why this may not be possible, but it's an interesting idea to think about. If you were hiring a team at the same time, you probably would deliberately try not to hire the same sort of person. You'd probably try and make it as cognitively diverse as possible. I mean, I'm a big fan of diversity, not just because it's right and it's fair. I'm a big fan because it works. That's the simple fact of the matter. All my experience of the more diverse groups or decision-making bodies or companies, I tend to think they tend to be the long-term winners. And I think it's particularly because of this idea of cognitive diversity. People from different backgrounds, races, religions, whatever it may be, bring different perspectives to the table. And back to my point about, a change in perspective is worth 80 IQ points. And I think that's how you create a great team but it's obviously budgetary constraints when you can't always employ a team at the same time, or it's not practical to do so, or you don't want to. But it's worth remembering when you do hire people, not to try and hire them so they look like the people who are already there. You need some individuals, and being authentic is part of that experience if you're going to try and get hired, I suppose. Certainly, I'd hope so.
I was reflecting on thinking about it. So if you were putting a band together, you wouldn't want 4 Mick Jaggers. You'd have a range of different skills. And yet, if Mick were to somehow retire from the singing thing, you'd be looking to replace with something fairly similar. So I think it's obvious why we do that, but it is a really interesting piece around how do we open ourselves up. And I think it's back to structures again. I think one of the things I think is fascinating is as you were talking, we've got some structures and some ways of doing things that just don't help us in this regard because they were set some time ago without thinking about some of these dynamics. And so many of the processes that we see, whether it's in the investment world or whether it's in the corporate world, don't necessarily get the most out of people because they condition you to think in a certain way and to follow certain patterns, which feels easy and comfortable, like an old pair of slippers, but actually isn't necessarily getting the best out of us from a cognitive perspective. So if your recruitment process funnels in a particular way, and as you say, you're only able to hire one individual, then that's going to lead to certain predictable outcomes. And breaking out of that's quite hard.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because that works in both the cultural sense of an organization, but actually again, back to my industry, investment, you see it with investors, you see it in terms of individual investors and indeed the investment culture of a firm. And I mentioned at the beginning that I think behavioral science has helped me in two ways. One is in terms of communication, but two is in terms of investment policy. I've become very impressed recently with a company called behavioural that uses a combination of software and analytics, sort of high-tech stuff, if you like, to analyse how a portfolio is constructed, what happens to the buys and sells, does the manager hold on to stocks too long, too little, whatever it may be. But then adding to that sort of that analytics side of it, there's a sort of consultancy side of it, which they allow asset managers or fund managers to look at their process and see where their biases come into the process. And therefore, to use the phrase, they can de-bias themselves. They can literally change their process to recognize it. And there's been they've got some stunning examples. One of their clients is a superb investor, excellent at buying stock. But the analysis reveals that actually they may be the best investors in the world, and they are, just about literally are, but they're not very good at selling. And so again, when you see something like this, you see where you can lose performance. You can be very credible about how I choose a stock, but if you don't know how to sell it, then you're missing out. And so it's a combination of if you like, the sort of software and the technical analysis of the portfolio plus the consultancy advice afterwards. And I think that what they're doing certainly is one of the most interesting things I've seen. I mean, when I was at my final employer, Goldman, and I was obviously really, really sort of flying the behavioural flag there. It was getting loads of meetings. People were very interested in it. And yes, there were lots of aspects of behavioural science, the way that the asset managers were doing it. But we didn't really have what I describe as a pure behavioural product. And I always wanted to do that. And so when I left them in end of 13, beginning of 14, I wanted to do something. So what I ended up doing was to basically fly the flag, wave the flag even harder, if you like, telling people how good behavioural science was. And I've been working with doctors and asset managers and lawyers and various others. And then as I say, I came across this company, Behavioural Lab, last year, and I'm really excited about what they're doing because they seem to be doing everything I'd have liked to have done a few years ago. So we'll see. But they've been very successful so far. I'll be watching them very closely and hopefully even maybe getting involved a bit myself.
I think that's really interesting because as you were talking there, I just thought, okay, so we hire people to be a fund manager, right? So your job is to pick some stock, decide what you're going to buy, hold on to it, check the performance, and then sell at the right time. But if you think about that, actually, it feels like it's a job. But you're totally correct in that probably the person that's chosen to buy something, that's invested the time and effort to research it, might well be overly wedded to that decision, back to confirmation bias. So are they the best person to decide to sell that thing? Well, actually, probably not. And yet we've created a role there that requires them to manage those particular tensions. You could say a much smarter way would be to say, okay, we're going to identify the people that are good at picking them. And it's somebody else who's better at calling time, that isn't tainted with the decision-making process and the biases to go with it, that we better at looking at the selling piece. And it occurs to me actually that we've created jobs and roles for people that don't necessarily get the most out of them because it requires them to manage different things, different tasks. And if I think about some of the management roles I've had in the past, that is a combination of being willing to go to really boring meetings, being good with handling people, knowing how to present. And there's a whole host of things that aren't necessarily compatible skills. And yet we bundle this thing together because of the structures that we have. And I think that example of somebody, being really good at picking stocks, but not illustrates an interesting point, which is if you look at labor in the 21st century, one, you can get technology to help out, as you were pointing out. But the second thing is, I think we should start thinking about breaking jobs up a little bit. and recognizing that you cannot be good at everything. So what we try and do in organizations is we sort of go, okay, you're really good at these things. You should improve these areas. In some respects, actually, it might be better off going, okay, you're really good at this. Let's have you spending more time doing that. If you're crap at something, let's not try and or don't enjoy it. Let's not try and reprogram you so that we sort of pretend that you can. And actually, we focus your job on the things that you're really good at. And I think there's a really interesting there's a philosophy there that says actually job structures, particularly now with digital ways of working, the technology, we could change some of this stuff actually and get more out of people in a positive sense if we started to think in those terms and analyze what people are actually doing.
Yeah. I think what you're proposing is that every firm should have a chief behavioural officer, a CBO. I mean, someone said once to me why do all creative companies have financial departments, but no financial companies have creative departments? And it's seriously, I mean, I think we and someone said, well, you need a CBO, a behavioural officer, someone who's actually going around the floor, if you like, trying to find some of the things you highlighted in your last comment about can we be a bit more creative? Can we actually, as opposed to this, again, data-driven, solely data-driven. And one of the reasons why I like the Behaviour Lab approach so much is because they're not relying just on data. Data is a huge integrated part of the process. But on top of it, there's a lot of judgment and then working with the client to look at the process in particular, the client's investment process. And I think that's really, really interesting and something that is potentially a game changer. So you're right. You need to be more creative, and I'm kind of hoping that this whole lockdown thing that we've had, there's so much thinking gone on. So I'll give you a little example from different. Think about it. Anything that you or I do or have previously associated with in terms of work or that has been done in the office, somehow we've managed. Like somehow we've got through it, and in many cases there's been huge improvements. I know one large company, I won't name them, a massive insurance company that did a disaster recovery thing a few years ago and said we could never work online ever. It would be it'd take ages and ages and ages if ever. Come COVID, they did it within 3 days. It was all sorted out within 3 days, and systems, everything. Now, again, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's not without problems and faults. But out of any challenge that the biggest we've had in lockdown and COVID, there will be winners who come out of it who will be creative and will do things. And it's extraordinary now. I mean, some of the huge new offices in the city, or big buildings, I should say, not just offices, big buildings, empty now. And it's very hard to see how we'll ever return to the way it was. And in a way, it's a sad thing. In some ways, it's a good thing if something better comes out of it. And I think that we need to recognize the fact that there are huge benefits. I mean, not wasting time going around the world, jumping on a plane for an hour meeting and then coming all the way back. I mean, for God's sake, let's just do it by Zoom. Now, again, I wouldn't recommend that for every meeting, but I'm surely there'll be enough people now looking at their previous scheduling of global meetings and thinking, we didn't need to do that many, really. We didn't, in person. But again, it's not just about saving money. It's about being more efficient, allowing people to be more creative in other areas. It's not just a spreadsheet, the tyranny of the spreadsheet thing. It's not just about saving money on travel. That will have obviously benefits from a carbon point of view. But it's actually about being more creative and doing something different. And I think I've seen lots of examples of people actually being better. One little example is back to the world of magic again. Now, it's been hell for most magicians. Most magicians in lockdown have suffered because most working magicians rely upon parties, weekends, being employed, and obviously that's all gone by the wayside. But the really creative ones have reinvented themselves very quickly as Zoom magicians. And do you know what? Just as people can't have parties, they can have Zoom parties, so they need Zoom magician. And it's an art. It's different. It's much, but it's the most creative ones have done really well and thriving on it. Now, that's a bit of a niche area, but it's happening everywhere. And we have to adjust and adapt and then create something better.
And it is interesting when you talk about this, the sort of, we could never do that, and then suddenly it's forced on you. I mean, there is an extreme logic that sort of says, what we've gone through now is almost been a major, it's a major thing, and so if it takes something big to affect change, and so this is this has been one hell of a shock for certain things. And there is a certain propensity to sort of, well, we need to get, you get the two extreme views, right? It'll never go back to the way it was before, which we know is in extremis is nonsense. But equally, nothing is going to, everything is going to change. Also, I think there's an interesting balancing act here of sort of taking the bits, changing the bits that we can, recognizing what was good in the old, but recognizing what's good in the new. And actually the direction of travel that the new has pointed us in, where we can start to think about questioning orthodoxy and challenging traditional ways of thinking, I think is really interesting, and how we get that balancing act. And as I look at, particularly sort of, here in the UK, lots of tradition and things that we've always done. And on the one hand, I watch the state opening of Parliament. On the one hand, I go, lovely spectacle, looks very nice on television, maybe brings a few tourists in. And then you look at it and go, does that make sense anymore? Should we be doing that? Is that fit for purpose in the 21st century? And I think there's a lot of interesting questions there around traditions that we've cleaved to, processes, ways of doing things, that says, actually, we need to start looking at the substance and saying, why do we still understand why we do this? And does that make sense? Now, we shouldn't throw everything out, because we know there's sometimes really good, valid reasons that people have thought about for a long time, those values, but sometimes they're not. And it's that fascinating, that balancing act. And I think, back to the sort of perception of things, we often perceive that, it's been done that for some time, therefore that's a good, there must be a reason. And I'm going to stick to that particular thing. And what we've had exposed here is that reason either wasn't necessarily good in the first place, or is no longer valid given changes in circumstance.
You made me think, there's a Somerset Maugham quote: tradition is a guide and not a jailer.
Nice.
Think about that. So in other words, by the way, isn't that wonderful? Because if something survived for a long time, well, this is kind of weird Nassim Taleb territory, there's a Lindy effect. There's a reason why it survived a long time. But that doesn't necessarily mean, and you must learn from that and accept it, appreciate it, whatever it may be. But I think in terms of the new technological world that we live in, we've got to remember we have to adapt and create. And so I love this idea of tradition being a guide, not a jailer. So can we learn, as you put it, can we learn from the best bits and discard the bits that don't work so well? And the problem with it is that it's completely wrong to be totally and utterly reliant on the past for everything. I'm a historian, so I'm biased. I think you can learn lots of things from the past, but I don't think necessarily history repeats itself, although it does seem to rhyme quite a lot. But I do think that we can learn from it. But I'm certainly not stuffy and, it was much better in the old days, because the world's changing. The technology alone has changed our world more in my lifetime than it's probably done for the previous 200,000 years. So got to move on. And it fascinates me, and someone needs to sort of shake up this idea of something like the COVID problem. Interesting enough, some people have looked at Brexit in that way and say, look, it's never going to happen in the same way that it wouldn't have happened ordinarily. No government would vote for Brexit, as it were, but the people were given a vote, they did. It's going to shake things up. Whatever your views are of it, and there'll be extreme passions on both sides, but it's going to be changed. Now, do we embrace that change and try and do something with it? Or do we just say, I don't want, this is rubbish? And I think that the winners, whether it be in business, technology, will say something has changed dramatically. Let's embrace it and let's work with it. And that's certainly how I see things.
And I think your point on the emotions is really interesting. And because I was reflecting on who am I listening to in this world? Because actually technology is an interesting thing. Because on the one hand, I have access to a ton more voices, views, opinions, experience, data than I've probably ever had in my lifetime. Because I'm sort of sat in a space where, every single thing I get pretty much comes through a screen. If it's up to date stuff, it comes through a screen of some form. I'm sure I can order books and things like that. But the bottom line is I'm consuming most of my stuff because I'm not having those contacts with, certainly not prolonged contacts with people that aren't in a digital format. And so as I look at that I'm fascinated because on the one hand, we've got more information than ever before at our fingertips, freely available as well. It's not even costing in many cases. On the other hand, we've got polarization at an all-time high and people not taking advantage of those things. And I'm really struck with that tension because actually, if you could shift some of these pieces, so shift some of those biases that said, stop just reading the same news sources. Don't just depend on your echo chamber. Go explore new voices. It's really easy to do in a way that it wouldn't be easy to do in the physical world, because I'm constrained by in the digital world. I've got that freedom. And yet what the digital world seems to thrive on, partly because things are built and designed this way, is precisely the opposite. So we have a great opportunity to almost think in terms that you were outlining, and yet a propensity not to do so.
Yeah, it's combining our Paleolithic emotions with our sort of godlike modern technology, and there is a creative tension there. But again, I put to you that I think, let's just think about our perspective on this. I mean, again, who was it? Louise Leakey. She was a daughter of famous anthropologist and archaeologist. And she, if you haven't seen her TED talk, it's brilliant. And I'll try to remember it. In her TED talk, she tries to sort of talk about humanity and about the problems facing humanity. But she wants to remind us of quite where we fit in the scale of things. And she comes up with this metaphor, says, imagine the age of the earth is like a 400 sheet roll of laboratory paper, of loo paper, right? So it's 400 sheets in that loo paper. And you lay them out. So you unravel it, you lay them out. Now that represents the age of the earth. You start at number 400 and you go down. And as you go down, it's not until you get to the 19th from the end that the dinosaurs appear, right? You've got to keep on walking down the loo paper, right? And you get to the 5th sheet from the end, and that's when the dinosaurs died out. So the dinosaurs lasted from the 19th to the 5th sheet of loo paper, right? Then kind of mammals came in. Now, when did Homo sapiens come in? So the dinosaurs died out in the 5th. Homo sapiens appear on the last sheet of loo paper. And where did they appear on the last sheet of paper? In the perforation. They're literally in the perforation, right? We are literally, we are insignificant in terms of the planet Earth. And sometimes I love things like that, or Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot, which many people will be familiar with, that famous speech he wrote about just to remind ourselves that actually, we kid ourselves that everything we do is absolutely sort of intense, and we're being bombarded with this and that, and our world is so important, and so we're the center of our universe. And yes, that's all, by the way, true. But in the sort of scheme of history, our problems are pretty insignificant relative to some of the great forces that have existed. And I sometimes have to tell myself things like this when things seem bad. And it's, again, it's more behavioral science. How do you use this stuff to cope with issues you have in your own head? And so the sort of a different perspective, again, like that often helps me to sort of see that a problem I think is really bad, it's actually pretty insignificant in the face of the world. Another way of doing it, and again, this is fascinating because it's sort of when we're trying to deal with problems, and that was your question, is how do we cope with them? If you have a really bad issue, a business issue or whatever, sometimes it's very hard for you to deal with it. But if you said to me, Paul, what do you think? I might have a perspective that's different. So I always say to somebody who's struggling in the office, or forget that it's your problem. What would you advise someone else who had this problem to do? And it's really weird, Christian, because if you do this, if you, as I call it, third party it becomes much easier to see some sort of way forward. I've actually got a sticker. I confess, years ago I ran in the New York Marathon, and I was wearing a T-shirt. I was running for the John Wayne cancer charity, and this was in LA, and it was my 6th and last marathon, I think it was, in LA. When you went to pick up your John Wayne T-shirt and a charity thing, it's for his cancer thing, I got a sticker, which I confess I kept, and it's stuck inside my my cupboard door, and I see it every day, and it says WWJWD. And when I first got this speaker, I didn't know what it meant, and what it stands for is, what would John Wayne do? Right? And it sounds weird. Okay, it sounds weird, but sometimes if somebody comes to me, I might think, what would John Wayne do in this? I'm third partying it. Okay, so it's what would John Wayne advise me to do? Would be another way of looking at it. I wouldn't recommend John Wayne, by the way, because his solution may not be the desired one. But the way I would say more seriously is, how would you advise a friend who had this problem to deal with it? And again, I think this is interesting because when you get into this sort of world of different perspectives, it's actually easier to understand people's political differences with you. So someone who may have a completely different idea from your own politics. You can almost try and get inside their shoes or inside their head, if you like, as opposed to just think you're a bloody idiot because you don't agree with me, and I'm a bloody idiot you think because I don't agree with you. And it just creates a level of, should we say, slightly improved civilization in terms of political debate. But more importantly, for problems, challenges, debate, then ask yourself, if you have a problem, what would think, and pick a hero of yours, or pick a friend of yours that you admire, or a relation of yours, what would they do? And once you start to do that and think like that, it's never quite as bad, the issue. It's never quite as bad. And again, so we've kind of got off the track of investment and various other things. But I think it's important, this stuff, because again, it comes back to how the mind does and doesn't work very well, and how the mind makes immediate shortcuts. And if it's your own problem, those synapses are snapping away there and creating all sorts of problems. But if it's someone else's problem, you can actually step back and analyze it. So why not pretend your problem is someone else's problem and then try? And again, these little things here, and it's stuff like that. Or and I joked about the age of the Earth and stuff relative to us being the last perforated piece of a 400 sheet piece of blue paper. But sometimes you need to do things like that. Whenever I find a fact that sort of blows my mind, I write it down as a way of just distracting myself. So, yesterday's fact, which I came across, was that sharks are older than trees.
I saw you posted that on social media. I was just like, you caused me to stop.
Yeah.
Which, as I was doom scrolling on Twitter, was quite an impressive feat.
Yeah, sharks are forward. I did actually check it afterwards. Sharks. I posted stuff on my Twitter handle all the time, which is at Craven Partners, and there's lots of behavioural stuff in there, but there's occasional stuff like that. So, recognising that sharks are 420 million years old as a species, and the earliest trees 350 million years old, that blew my mind, and it stopped me. And it's weird how little things like that are very, very the way the human mind talks. Darren Brown, the brilliant magician, conjurer, illusionist, you can call him what you like. He's just fantastic. In one of Darren's books, he talks about once when he was a student at Bristol, and I think he was walking home late at night and in the sort of residential area, but it was empty and there was dark, and the street lamp under the street lamp, he saw someone approaching or come up to him from behind who was going to threaten him or mug him. And it was pretty clear the guy was of a hostile nature. And Darren, who's a master of the mind, even in those days, was a brilliant at a young age. In order to stop the confrontation, he turned around to this guy who was following him, and he said something like, I think it was this, he said, "These walls around here are rather low, aren't they?" And the guy who was presumably had a knife or was about to cosh him. Now just think about the cognitive dissonance going on. The guy said, this guy has just said, these walls around here are rather low. It makes no sense. But in that sense of just stopping him from what he was doing, Darren was then able to, he writes that he was then able to turn and walk briskly away without running away, just walk away, while the guy was momentarily dazzled by this weird thought. Now, again, I'm not, again, the whole theme of behavioural science isn't about this sort of thing, but it just shows you how the mind does play tricks. And my favourite thing, often that sort of starts with my talks with this, is I put a picture up of a thing called the Mappakanzat pebble, which is millions of years old, and it's literally a pebble about the size of 2 or 3 fists. And it's got what looks like a 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth on it. Google it; it's fantastic. And why this Mappakanzat pebble is so interesting is because we know that where it was found in South Africa was in a cave. We also know through various dating techniques and the geology of the area that it could not have been formed there. It was taken there. And we know it was formed. It was never carved out by any hand. It was just erosion. The erosion of being in a stream or a river happened to create this shape, this pebble with 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth on it. And it's uncanny. It's really good. And because they've analysed this thing, and they reckon it was made, it was originally sort of seen in a riverbank or a riverbed or something by one of our human ancestors 6 million years ago. So it certainly wasn't Australopithecus. It was probably Australopithecus or someone ancient. It wasn't anything to do with the Homo sapiens lot, and would have seen this and picked it up and thought, oh, that looks like a human face. Sorry, not a human face. Looks like a face. And he or she put it in their little bag or whatever they were carrying millions of years ago. And it ended up in a cave nowhere near where it would have been formed. And this is the first example of pareidolia, the idea being you see faces when they exist. So this has been created a face in the riverbed. Something had seen it, picked it up, and maybe it went through sort of 10,000 generations. We don't know, but it certainly was where it was found was nowhere. And I love this idea that even then, all those years ago, that the mind was playing tricks in terms of the what I thought I saw. It's not a face; it's a pebble. But even now, we see faces in clouds. We see faces in cheese. We see. It's fascinating because some things haven't changed at all in that sense. The way our brains are hardwired, and that I think is for me is where. That's why I just love behavioural science and why I love magic. And that Makakanzak pebble I think it was 3 million years. I think about 3 million years ago, which is extraordinary, really. And it's kind of where my interest. I think it's the earliest known example of something that's relevant to behavioural science.
Wow, that is an amazing note on which to finish things. Before I let you go, if my listeners want to get hold of you, because I know you will have sparked all sorts of interest on a range of different topics, how can they find you?
My website is www.paulcraven.com. And on Twitter, I'm at Craven Partners. And I would love to have a chat with anybody that wants to have a chat with me.
Fantastic. Well, you are for obvious reasons, a highly recommended follow from me. I will put links to the multitude of things that we talked about and your website and social media accounts in the show notes. But in the meantime, thank you so much for being an absolutely brilliant guest. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Time has flown as ever, which is the biggest compliment I could pay anyone. But thank you for everything you've done and for being a great guest on the podcast.
That's extremely kind of you. And thank you very much indeed for having me. I really appreciate it.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Paul for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Paul and the work that he does and details of his social media accounts, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. I've also put in links to some of the topics that we discussed during our conversation. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and haven't yet left a 5-star review, please do so. It really does help attract high-quality guests like Paul and allows other people to find the show. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. But in the meantime, if you need more human risk content, do visit human-risk.com and you'll find links to the video channel, newsletter, and other resources there. Stay safe. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you very soon for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.